Hello, this is Reverend Dr. Chris Wilson at St. Andrew Christian Church, and here to promote worship and my sermon in particular. For this week, we've been in a series called The Quest for Belonging. We have talked about accessibility, we've talked about diversity, and this week the focus word is inclusion. The passage of Scripture is not a narrative piece, but a metaphorical, image-based piece for this week. It comes from the letter of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. It's the first 11 verses. And in that, Paul talks about the nature of gifts and the use of gifts. And one of the things I think is fascinating about this passage is there is this listing, and Paul does lots of things in his letters where he makes lists of things. You have the fruits of the Spirit and various things that he does to name lists. And one of the things he does in this first 11 verses of chapter 12 is he names the variety of gifts that can be used in the life of the church. The interesting thing for me is the way that Paul orders the gifts. At that time, Corinth would have seen the most valuable gifts being speaking in tongues and interpreting tongues. And you look at this list that Paul puts down here, and it's the last two gifts mentioned in this chapter of 1 Corinthians. The fascinating about that is in Greek, when you use the Greek language, you can order the words any way you want to. You don't have to have them in a particular order like you do in the English language. In Greek, you end up putting the most important words at the front end of the sentence and the least important words at the back end of the sentence. It highlights what to pay attention to in a sentence by having the most important things first. When you look at the wider body of material of this first 11 verses, it's pretty telling that speaking in tongues and interpreting tongues, which seem to be the most important, are put at the very end of the list. Paul is trying to reconstruct for the church in Corinth what they think is important and realign levels of importance to have a sense of inclusion, that there's not one gift more important than another gift, that each gift brings its own value, that each person has their unique voice that's important. And we need all the voices at the table. And that's what Paul does in this passage as he's trying to navigate through Corinth that's filled with all kinds of issues and troubles and conflict. He tries to tell them, don't create an order of who's more or less important in your church based on their gifts. God sees each of you as uniquely created, and no person should be above or below anybody else. So this nature of inclusion is leveling the playing field. In the real world, we like to have orders of who's more important, which degrees are more important than others. But in faith world, all those barriers are broken down, and we have inclusion where everybody gets to be at the table with one another. So join us as we reflect on inclusion this coming Sunday in worship.